Welcome to Teaching Artist Podcast, a show dedicated to discussions of teaching art to kids, making art, and how those things overlap and feed each other. I'm Rebecca Potts, your host, a visual arts teaching artist.
Hi, thank you so much for listening. I'm so excited to share this episode with Lizz Denneau with you. I also want to send a big deep breath this fall. I have been teaching on a cart at 2 schools, and it has been a lot. If you're feeling overwhelmed with teaching through this continuing pandemic, I'm with you. You are not alone. Let's take a deep breath together. And sending some air hugs and contactless high fives like I do with my students. Lizz Denneau is making incredible artwork while teaching with a focus on contemporary art in a rural Arizona high school. I loved getting to learn more about her work and the ideas and processes she pursues as an artist. She talked about leaning into her intuition and the incredible paths that leads her down. Her striking visuals have so much depth of form and texture, as well as meaning and history. She talked about her childhood as a biracial person and how she's been digging into the history of the Black half of her family and processing through her artwork. She's able to create work that is both deeply personal and so connective. Lizz also shared her experience working with the Art 21 Educators Institute, which provided resources, connections with fellow art educators, and methods for sharing contemporary work in the classroom. She offered helpful insights into teaching with a social justice lens in a conservative district, which echoed what I hear again and again: build relationships. Getting to know your students is so vital. Elizabeth Denneau is an artist and art educator residing in the Sonoran Southwest. In her artistic practice, she is continually influenced by narratives of human perseverance, vulnerability, hidden histories, and power dynamics. Elizabeth works in a number of mediums, which are often inspired by her time as a fashion designer. In an attempt to connect with her ancestors, her current work is a series of sculptures that revolve around the unspoken, buried, and erased histories of the antebellum South and their reverberations throughout generations into modern culture. She teaches contemporary art and culture at Marana High School in Tucson, Arizona, while working with local community organizers and colleges to develop practical models of social justice in art education. Her desire is that her students will be able to see themselves better represented in the art world and be inspired to pursue their own artistic journeys. She is currently a 2023 MFA candidate at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Let's hear from Lizz. I am talking with Lizz Denneau today, and I'm excited to get to know you more and hear more about your experience. And I love to just start with that background. Could you kind of talk us through how you got into both art and teaching?
Well, first, it's great to be talking with you.
Yes.
So I've worn a ton of different hats. You know, like most artists, we start from a young age. I grew up pretty poor. And so when you're poor, you're resourceful. So in my teens, early 20s, I was making my own clothes, something that I had done throughout my school age because I couldn't really afford new clothes. So I would try and find ways, some of them disastrous, to refurbish old clothes. So that eventually evolved into a clothing line, which in my late 20s was called Siobhan Clothing. And it was kind of bespoke. Just, I would paint on clothes. It was probably more artistic than commercial at that point. And then I moved into doing it full time and had a line called Candy Strike. And the most important thing about Candy Strike for me was that I made clothing from extra small to 4XL. And I made it myself. I had some wonderful interns and I had an assistant, but for the most part, it was, kind of a one-woman show. And I did that for a couple years. And during that time, I was also painting. I was a painter, and that often translated into the clothing that I made. I also screen printed on fabrics and those sorts of things. But after a while, making the same dress 100 times is just like, it's too much. So I quit. It was too much. I was, working 16-hour days to just barely stay out of the red. So I went back and I was like, okay, during that time, I had also been, before I went full-time, working throughout the school system. I've always worked with youth. I was a social worker while I was doing Siobhan clothing. I worked with kids in crisis and group homes. And so kids education and art education had always been like kind of this like secondary force throughout what I was doing. I started programs at a youth center called Scrappy's out here in Tucson, Arizona. And so I didn't really know what I wanted to do. To be honest, I was very like broken by the experience because fashion design is one of those things where you can look really successful and not make any money. And it was an exhausting, venture. So I went back and worked in an HR office at a school district, which was kind of new for me. I was usually in the schools. And I was like, oh, I would watch, the HR office was on a high school campus, and I would watch the kids. And I just really knew that I was in the right place, but I was not in the right department, that I wanted to be teaching art. So I went back to school at 37 to get my bachelor's and get a certificate so I could teach in K through 12 classrooms, teach art education. Wow. When the program here at the University of Arizona is called Art and Visual Culture Education, and there's a studio component. So I started making work in the studio and kind of fell in love with printmaking and those sorts of things. And it really just kind of re-inspired my artistic practice. So it was kind of, I guess the artistic practice before then was like fashion design, but it was also fashion for profit. So it was jumbled. So I just kind of gave myself some space and started making work. And then I started teaching. So it's only recently in the past 3 years that I've fallen into what I feel like is kind of this marriage of my history in fashion design and 3D design and drawing. So it's kind of manifested in these like kind of sculptural assemblage looking things.
Yeah, I'm looking at your sculptures and they're just incredible. And I love the connection between like, you have paintings, prints, and then sculptures, and you can totally see the thread that ties them all together, which is also impressive. I feel like that's not always an easy thing to do, to work across media and have it still be cohesive and like it all tells a story and it all fits together.
Thank you for that. I don't always feel that way. So it's like kind of the continuation of just trying to congeal all these different things. I have a lot of different interests. I might not be doing sculpture forever, but right now that's what I'm obsessed with. But I also love to print. So
yeah. And it's so interesting hearing the fashion background too. Just how that ties into the art making now. And then I'm curious how that might tie into teaching too.
Well, where I teach now, I teach in a rural high school outside of Tucson. And I think that element really came about. I developed a printmaking program there. And, printmaking is really popular with kiddos. Once they figure out what it is, they don't always know.
Right.
You tell them printmaking, anybody really, and they're like, what? What is that? And then,
what does that
mean?
Yeah,
exactly. The minute you say t-shirts, you've got like 16-year-olds hooked. Like, what? So it does manifest a lot in the printmaking class, but also, I teach advanced art courses, so advanced and AP and intermediate, and a lot of, especially in AP, I like to I only teach really contemporary art. I don't teach intentionally the westernized European canon, like the classical canon, unless I'm teaching it through contemporary art. And that's like another component of my teaching practice and artistic practice of decentering whiteness and white supremacy in the classroom. So I have a focus on social justice and maybe critical race theory in my classroom. So a lot of times I will show them contemporary work but they'll be designers. You know, we look at Virgil Abloh and, you know, older, rest in peace, amazing fashion designers that kind of straddled that line between fashion and art, like Alexander McQueen. He's a favorite of my students. So, and I'm still very influenced by those things when I'm creating as well. And I think it manifests most in the sculpture, in that a lot of my former work, well, I guess also the process. My favorite stuff to do when I was a fashion designer is I would find these old dresses, like this vintage stuff, and I would rip it apart and make it new. Like I would print on it, I would reconstruct it, and I'm really kind of doing the same thing with the sculptures. So it's like almost like the same process. Wow, I think I just realized that now talking to you.
That's amazing. I love that. So in your sculptures, are you starting with some object that you've, like, I'm curious because there's these sort of busts are those totally created, or those are?
So no, they're most of them, I'm trying to think. Some of them are created from scratch, like the ones that are mostly the ones that are not busts. So Virtue is of the uterus and like the praying children around it. That one was created, the actual, form of the uterus was created through clay and wire and wood pulp, actually. But when you're looking at the busts, what you're really looking at is an object. Maybe it's a mannequin head or something that I found. And what I do is I might cut it apart, I strip it, and then I build on top of it. So the faces that you see are my creation. They're not what what the mannequin head originally looked like, but I build on top of them. Sometimes I cut things out of them and then I adorn them. So that's where that kind of assemblage part comes. So I am working with found objects a lot of the time.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
And how that ties into working with, sort of the same thing, like you were saying, the found dresses that you would then remake.
Yeah. I have a thing about taking existing objects and reworking them in a way. It brings me a lot of pleasure. I'm not quite sure why. Maybe just because, as a kid, that's something that I would do, is the things that I had in my house. If I wanted a cool new backpack and we couldn't afford it, I might paint it or do something on top of it to make it look different from the backpack I had last year, that sort of stuff. So maybe it's just kind of an ingrained, creative process for me. I don't know.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I was also, maybe this is a stretch, but it was making me think, taking an existing thing and reworking it, trying to, make it better, change it, is somehow, to me, there's a connection there in what you were talking about with teaching, not teaching the Western canon, teaching it only through contemporary art, really focusing on critical race theory and moving away from this existing white-centered world we live in and reworking it, remaking it.
Yeah, I guess
making it so that it's inclusive.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I think that would be correct. Yeah. Look at you teaching me stuff about my practice.
I love it.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And that's something that, I love to hear about and talk about, and just I'm constantly learning from other educators how to do that better. And I don't know, I'd love to hear if you have any if you want to share some of your process in teaching, getting into more of the nitty gritty. How would you make those connections for students? And do you have any sort of I was going to say favorite projects, but I know that we don't all teach that way. Like I've kind of gone back and forth between more student centered versus more like teacher led project based teaching. But yeah, I guess if you have any advice for other teachers around that topic.
Yeah, so I would say that right now, and you probably know this as well, being an art educator, there's this paradigm shift that happened a couple of years ago away from discipline-based arts methodology, and now we're into this kind of art and visual culture, which also has a social justice thread in it, right? Because it's
Yeah.
based a lot around contemporary art, and contemporary art talks about contemporary issues. And it's scary
Yes.
for some art teachers. I've had a lot of conversations and sometimes arguments about, teaching contemporary work. It can be kind of scary. It can be confusing depending on what artist you're looking at. And so when I first started doing this work, I immediately sought out resources, and I actually was picked to be part of the 2018 cohort for the Art 21 Educators Institute, which
awesome.
I suggest anybody, if you feel like doing this, you should. It is an amazing experience. I have resources and art educator friends all over the country, now internationally. And it really helped me break down contemporary work into that whole chunk and chew, like little bits that make, where you can lead those connections. But I do teach projects, right? Like those kind of more teacher guided projects where, there's some freedom, and I try to give them a lot of freedom in materials. I introduce them to a lot of different materials, but there's a point, say maybe in my intermediate class, where I'm trying to guide them so they can start seeing. So many kids come to us with this very narrow vision of what art is supposed to be and what it looks like. And so I spend a lot of time guiding them through different projects to kind of get their feet wet and playing with contemporary methods and materials, and get them out of that headspace that, everything is hyper realism and it's all painting. It's all, it's all this 2D stuff. And then generally I start letting them loose, and by the time they're in my advanced class, they're looking at, it's more about how do you visually portray what's in your head? How do you talk about something using visual language, like your own? What is your visual, what is your visual language? What does that look like? And so I use a lot of Art 21 resources for that, actually, because they're just brilliant, and they have a lot of resources for educators. The scary part about teaching contemporary work is that social justice element for a lot of people, because you're afraid of what a kid might say to you when you show them The Miraculous Sugar Baby by Kara Walker, right? You're just like, okay, what is this kid going to say? My district is incredibly conservative. Whether you teach Westernized canon or if you teach contemporary work, if you're going to teach that, and if you're going to have a thread of social justice or any sort of race theory or anti-racism in your classroom, the very first thing you have to do is know your students. You have to build relationships with each and every one of them. It can't be a passive thing. This year's harder, but last year I could tell you something about every single one of my students. And I think that it might be easier in high school. As art teachers, we have the privilege of walking around our classroom and helping students. Whereas, we're some disciplines, I think you're kind of stuck, teaching, formula or something like that. But a lot of my time is, here's a demo. This is, how we do this. And then walking around the room and helping students. And during that time, it's prime for me to get to know who they are. If your student respects you, they're going to respect the content that you're bringing towards them, and they're going to think about it more. If they trust you, especially. And if you make it known that the art room is a safe place for you to be vulnerable and for you to explore these ideas, even if you don't understand them. So I give them a lot of freedom. And one thing that I think if you're interested in using social justice or any of these kind of practices in your work, is really letting the artist speak for themselves and then asking your students, so what do you think about that? Right. So, we might watch something on Jordan Castile. There's a wonderful Art 21 video, and she talks about her practice going through Harlem, I think it is, and, the boroughs, and photographing these people that she feels like are underrepresented. The kids are smart. They'll tie those themes in themselves, and then they kind of take that inspiration with them. It's really lovely. You just have to be a little brave and don't, you don't have to take a stance. The only stance I take in my classroom is things that I will not tolerate, which I make very clear from day one. And then I enforce it if something happens, that this is a safe space. It's an intersectional classroom. I tell them what that means, that they're going to be looking at artists. They might not like their work, but they do have to consider it. And that becomes like a guiding principle in the classroom. So the students already know, well, this is Miss D, this is what she does, and they can leave if they don't like it. And, sometimes that happens. A kid's just not like, I had one student be like, well, I'm not really into all this culture stuff. And I'm like, that's cool, dude. It's fine. Like, that's fine. Just keep drawing. I don't take it personally, but that's what happens in my classroom. I think relationships are key, and then setting that safe space and enforcing it, not letting anything slide. When you hear kids say things or do things, correcting that behavior immediately, because you got to keep that space.
Yeah. And then the thing that I've been asked by other art teachers teaching in more conservative areas, and I don't ever have really good answers, but just how to deal with parents if there's pushback. And then I feel like the first thing that my first sort of answer to that is, that you're making sure your admin is with you, that they've got your back. But that's not always the case. I guess I'm curious how you handle that, if you ever get parent pushback, and, if it's been sort of a negotiation with your admin, or if they've kind of been right there with you.
When I took over the art program at the school that I'm at now, it was dying. There was there was very little enrollment. Classes were combined. And I think the first year of me teaching contemporary works and teaching this way, these kids live in a rural area. Tucson, which is not a very big city, feels like New York to them. So my first thing was like, let's get them out of the classroom. They hadn't gone on a field trip in 6 years. So one of the things that I think helped me was that after the first year of me teaching, I tripled my class sizes.
Wow.
So the kids talked, oh, we're going on field trips. We're looking at the very first field trip I took them on was to see 30 Americans, which is this traveling exhibition of 30 African-American artists with everybody from Basquiat to Kehinde Wiley, right? So seeing those pieces really just is impactful, especially rural students that don't get out of these kind of areas. So I think it was kind of like building street cred. And I was nervous. Like my first month, I was like, oh my God, what am I doing? I'm going to get fired. Stuff. And I just kept building those relationships with students. And then at some point I had to say, well, if I get fired, I get fired. This is what I'm doing here, And so I have not had a lot of pushback from parents. I actually think that has more to do with my relationships with my students, to be quite honest, because I think my students enjoy the content and enjoy what we're doing. So, for whatever reason, they're not complaining about the class, or they're just intentionally not telling those parents what they're learning in the class, which is fine. I do get some side eyes from parents and stuff, but I think especially with printmaking and the field trips and how excited kids get about art, that kind of combats that initial response. Although, I don't know. But so developing this program in a year and then having my class sizes triple, I think helped the administration be like, oh, we don't know what she's doing in there, but it's awesome. So we're just going to.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very clear when I got hired what my practice was about. So they knew that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just aware of things that go down in other programs and things like that. So like I always had kind of an argument back. I was not going to like go quietly into the night if this became an issue. So
Yes.
you kind of have to do your homework. And I occasionally would slip an article about contemporary works or social justice and art education to my evaluator or something like that. But for the most part, building that program kind of showed them that what she's doing is working and kids are excited about art and her classes are exploding. So and also I think if you're very clear at the beginning with your expectations of your community in your classroom in the artwork, and it gives kids who are not into that stuff, who are not willing to look at other cultures and at races and things like that through artwork, it gives them an out. Like, okay, maybe I'm going to transfer out of this class. And that's happened a couple of times. So it helps that my principal and my evaluator, they all support what I'm doing. They come in and they see that the kids are, doing critical thinking at a high level a lot of times. As art educators, people think we're just drawing in there, right? So if I know they're coming, I make sure that it's one of those high level days where they're talking about sustained investigations and, so it's not easy. And I've actually feel like, part of it is my tenacity, but also part of it is that I have, the support of my admin. It's not easy to do this work at all. It's hard. It's really hard. So I fully understand anybody who's like nervous about, you have to kind of be strategic about how you're doing this stuff for sure. Especially if you're a teacher of color, like I am. So you have to, it's not without incident, right? I've had kids carving Confederate flags in lino. I've had this year white supremacy elements like flags and things show up in some of the kids' work. There's a serious discussion about blackface. Like you have to be willing to take those head on. But even if I was just doing Westernized canon and just basic, like this is the golden triangle, those things would still pop up. But now I have these relationships with the kids. So when this kid is carving a Confederate flag in his lino, I can sit down and talk to him about it and still have a relationship with that student, but also teach them something. When I tell that student, how do you think this makes me feel as your Black teacher? His eyes got huge. He didn't, not once, because nowhere in his education and his culture at home is this a symbol of slavery, so we have to have these conversations. We have to be willing to have those conversations. I just talked a lot, but sorry.
Yeah, I know, but that's all so helpful and so incredible. And yeah, just building those relationships with students and being able to have the hard conversations, that's amazing. Like heartbreaking in some ways having to have that conversation, but yeah, just picturing sitting down with that student and him having a massive realization that maybe hopefully kind of changes the way he views the world.
Yeah,
that's so powerful. Yeah, that needs to happen with every student.
It does, and it's not easy. Like listen, this last year, I applied to grad school because I was like, whoa, this is a lot and I need a plan B. So it's not easy work. I think the more of us that are doing it, it becomes easier, but you also need to protect yourself as an artist and a teacher just in general from burnout, but especially if you're doing this hard stuff, right? It can come for you really quickly, and it can definitely, especially with a pandemic on top of it, it's exhausting.
Yeah. It's a lot. Yeah. And I hate, you mentioned this fear of getting fired, which I've heard again and again and again. And that just like it enrages me,
Mhm.
and it, it makes me so sad that that's something we even have to worry about. Like when we're doing work that is so desperately needed.
Mhm.
Uh,
Yeah,
I don't know where
no.
I'm going there. I'm just angry
No,
about it.
I feel you. I feel you. I feel that frustration and
Oh,
that anger. I totally feel that.
yeah.
Absolutely.
And angry on behalf of others because I'm not in that position at all. Like
Right.
you know, I'm in Los Angeles, and the schools I work for, the organization I work for is all, offering training around this stuff,
Oh,
and
it's
really,
wonderful.
really supportive. And like it's expected that we are talking about these things.
That's
Yeah.
really
So,
wonderful, though. That's awesome.
mhm.
I think that's awesome.
Yeah.
That's so
I
great.
just wish that was the case everywhere.
I know. It's going to take a very long time, I think. It's like a
Mm,
long haul.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then right now, I don't know if, like, I'm sure you're aware, Arizona actually might be one of them. There's several states
Oh
that
my
are
God.
working to pass legislation banning
Hmm.
talk about critical race theory, using the 1619 Project, which
Hmm.
is so powerful and such a great resource. Yeah. So I've been talking with other art teachers about taking action at trying to stop this.
Yeah,
But
it's
yeah.
Arizona.
Mm.
Arizona special. Arizona is the state that banned ethnic studies successfully years ago.
Ugh.
And thankfully, that was overturned and unconstitutional, but it took a
Mm.
while. And
Mm.
so they come up with all sorts of crazy things. Like just recently, in the past couple months, they introduced a bill that has not passed both houses, but that would state that we have, as teachers, any teacher has to put their entire curriculum up and available for parents to see, and that we are not allowed to stray from that curriculum. And if we do,
Ugh.
the parents can object to what we're teaching. They can object anyways. And I'm just like, who knows what they're teaching a year ahead of time? Like, I don't, especially
Ugh.
as art teachers, right? Because most of us are building our own curriculum. It's like in real
Mm-hmm.
time. So it's just another way to monitor what we're doing. They tried to
Mm-hmm.
outlaw just the term social justice.
Ugh.
Like you couldn't use it. That didn't pass. But yeah, there is another bill about, it's an element of the critical race issue, but this one feels even crazier to me because basically the bill states that if you're going to teach, say, the Holocaust, you have to teach both sides, whatever that means. So, like, you also have
Mm-hmm.
to say, but the Nazis, like, it's just insane. Like, you
Mm-hmm.
have to present both sides of this historic event or this movement or whatever. So, if you're teaching
Mm-hmm.
suffrage, you have to talk you have
Right.
to talk about like the people who want to continually oppress women and how that's valid some
Right.
way. It's insane. We're going to see
Yeah.
more of this. I just feel like it's going
Ugh.
to continue to happen. Yeah, we're
And we
just
have
going
to
to
continue to push it.
yeah, we're just going
Yeah.
to it's awful. It's exhausting. It's really
Mm-hmm.
frustrating, and
Yeah.
the 1619 project should just be standard curriculum, but
Mm-hmm.
we'll see.
Yeah.
Someday maybe.
Ugh. Yeah. I was trying to dig into some of the arguments in these bills and like why, what's real. I mean, I know what's really pushing buttons, but like,
Right, right.
yeah, one of the things I came across with the 1619 project was that it was not historically accurate.
Mm,
And I was like, what history curriculum is? Like, are you saying now that what they're teaching right now is historically accurate? Because no, it's not
no, it's not. No.
at all. Like,
Yeah. Yeah. And who decides that, right? We've got all these
yeah.
scholars and stuff who kind of set these standards and they all disagree with each other as well. So,
Mm-hmm.
but there's obviously huge gaps in learning. My
Mm-hmm.
students, a lot of my students find out about, historical events and things like that through the artists that I'm showing them. Or this idea,
Yeah.
like we do a sound suit project, right? We look at Nick Cave and
Mm-hmm.
we watched a video Art 21 did about Chicago artists that's really wonderful, as Theaster Gates and Nick Cave. But Nick Cave is a favorite in the classroom. Before my students encounter Nick Cave, they don't really understand what art can be, right? It can be costume, and it can be assemblage, and it can be performance. It really kind of opens their eye. But he talks about the genesis of the sound suit really had to do with Rodney King and the LA riots, and my students don't know about it. They didn't know. So then it becomes this teachable thing. And it also becomes this, like, they see this thread. Oh, this is still happening, right? This is still, this issue is still present. So we have discussions about that. You know, even if you're teaching Keith Haring, a lot of art teachers teach Keith Haring, but never talk about his work in his AIDS Foundation or ACT UP, like nothing. And I refuse to do that. I feel like it's a disservice to that artist to not talk about that. And a lot of students don't know about the AIDS crisis. They have no idea. So, you know, these bills threaten that sort of discussion, but we're going to continue to kill people if we don't learn from history. And if we keep trying to cover that up, you know, so really, art teachers, you're like little soldier warriors out there. It's a good fight. Don't give up. But I totally get it. Take care of yourselves. Self-care is huge. And that's really hard as a teacher. Yeah.
Yeah, there's such a balance there. That's tricky. And for me, I feel like my own art making is a big part of that. Like making time for that. Yeah. Because it's a lot. It can be overwhelming.
I personally struggle with art practice, like my art, that, you know, that the art educator and the artist, right? That and straddling that line is very hard. It's part of the reason why I'm going to grad school, right? Because I feel the work that I do as an artist is equally as important as the education. A lot of my artwork has to do with educating the public about things. But and I know that I feel better when I have an art studio, a very small one in downtown Tucson. And if I have a practice that I can keep, I know that I feel better. Just like if you exercise X times a week, you feel better, you know. It's a nourishment thing, but I can be perfectly honest with everyone when I say I haven't been in my art studio for a full quarter. Like this last quarter was such a crazy world that I didn't make it into my art studio. I will never let go of my art studio. It's going to stay there. But I'm forever, if anybody ever has the secret to being an art teacher and an artist, I want to know, because it's so hard. It's incredibly hard to do that. I think a lot of it has to do with setting boundaries with our students and our principals and our programs, you know, and that's hard.
Yeah. And really carving out the time, but there's a balance with carving out time for your art versus just taking care of yourself. You know,
yes.
You talked about rest and
it's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And were you back in person this last quarter? Have you been back in person for a while?
So, like I said, I work for a very conservative district. We have an anti-masker on our board. Nobody in Tucson or the surrounding areas went back as soon as we did. We were in person at the end of October. So
wow. Yeah.
we were hybrid and then went back. They went through different stages. So there was some crazy amount of schedule changes that happened. And I think people don't realize when you change a schedule or, you know, any sort of daily ops for your school, it requires the teachers to rework their entire curriculum. Especially when you've got kids at home and kids in the classroom. Like sometimes my students at home were doing something completely different from the kids in the classroom. And of course, the kids at home might just decide they want to come into the classroom. So now they're doing a totally different project. And then there was a lot of, transition going on repeatedly throughout. So it was a really difficult year because it was constant. And, I am not a vlogger, but I found myself doing more tutorials. I bought one of those like arms that you can, put your camera in and film. That was the only way. It was really kind of, especially with like printmaking's fun to try to figure out how to do at home as well. That was, there's a lot of art kits that I was making and things like that. So it was, we were in person for most of the year. The first quarter we were remote. So
yeah, but then back. And did it stay hybrid the whole year? Like you still had some kids at home and some kids in person, which is just, adds that whole other layer of juggling.
Yeah, we were hybrid so if you chose to stay home, you could. And we had shortened days. They would give us shortened days so we can meet with our remote learners after after school without staying past. But then eventually we went back to our regular schedule, which was another schedule change. And it was that was crazy. I was like, I've done this for 5 years now. I am exhausted. Like I've never. So, trying to go into your studio after a day like that is just, it felt impossible. I gave myself some room to just say, okay, you will have a summer, you will be in grad school, so you won't be able to do anything but art anyways. This will happen. Just take care of this right now. I think sometimes we have to be kind to ourselves as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And so will you be starting a full-time like MFA program, or will it be, you'll still be teaching and doing both?
So I am doing a low residency program, which I think a lot of professionals, especially teachers, do. I wasn't interested in eating ramen for another 2.5 years. I was like, no, that's not happening again. I like healthcare.
Yeah,
I'm going to keep
still working.
Yes. So I applied to a couple of programs. I got into the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And
oh, awesome.
Yeah, thank you. I was surprising. Yeah. That was a lark. But their program is 6 weeks in the summer and then remote during spring and fall. And so that worked for me. So I will be there this summer for 6 weeks. And it's funny because it's just like, it feels very luxurious to talk about just 6 weeks of making art and not anything else, It's kind of
amazing.
like a dream.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's how that program works. And anybody who's interested in getting their MFA, and I know that even art ed courses, like I think Micah has one that is low residency, that's tending to be like most schools have those now. I think it's a great option for us teachers. I mean, I'll have student loans for the rest of my life, but whatever, that was going to happen anyways.
Yeah. Don't even.
I know. I'm sorry. Sore spot.
Yeah. I'm like, oh man. Yeah. I feel like it was I love how you talked earlier about going back to school and getting certified to teach. But that going back to school, like there's a cost there.
Yes.
Yeah. And I never did that. I'm not actually certified. I did the full-time MFA, which was amazing. That's like awesome. 2 years of just focusing on art. But then I finished and I was like, now what?
Like what do I do now?
Now I have massive loans and no job prospects.
Yes. I totally understand that feeling.
Whoops.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but I would love to hear more about your artwork. And I know we talked a bit about like your process, which is so fascinating. Maybe you could talk about the concepts a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So my artwork, the work that I'm doing now, if you like hit my website or my Instagram, you'll see a lot of sculpture. There is some 2D work, but the main work that I do now started with my own sort of exploration of self. I am biracial. I'm half Black and half white. And my family, I grew up with my mother's side of my family, and my father's side was absent. I've never known them. So I don't know about the Black half of my family. And so I started trying to figure things out. And anybody who's Black and, been on Ancestry knows that there's not a lot of historical records. Now, there was a lot of records on my mother's side because they were immigrants from Ireland and the Ukraine. So there was those Ellis Island, census things going on, and I found a lot of information. So I kept hitting dead ends, and I was like, I just need to learn more about my history as an African American. And it might not be my specific history, but we all know that we're probably all kind of cast in this wide net of enslavement and migration and relocation and things like that. So I started really digging into research historically to kind of, find where I might fit there and to educate myself about my people that I didn't have. My white family is incredibly loving and accepting and protective. And they taught me everything that they possibly could, especially about the immigrant experience. However, they couldn't teach me Blackness, right? So I didn't grow up with that a lot. And I also faced I was a weird kid, right? I was like, I was this, light-skinned Black girl that listened to Depeche Mode when everybody was listening to Tupac. I was this weird, thing and I grew up in the hood too. So kids in the hood were like, who is this? Who does she think she is? Who is this person? And so I wasn't always accepted, and it became a sore spot for me growing up. And now as an adult and with all I understand where that came from. So it was really kind of reconnecting myself to this Blackness that I didn't know growing up. And so in my research, the first sculpture I ever made was called Mettre le feu, which means to set on fire or to burn down or something like that in French. And that is on the first page of my website. But that came about because I read this article about this belief that they have, and there's a lot of them, that Black men and women, enslaved individuals on plantations, were the braids in their hair and the patterns in their braids actually told stories, sometimes maps on how to get off the plantation. This idea that the braids that they were doing in their hair was a communication to other enslaved Black men and women. And it's not a stretch, right? Because we know about the quilts and the Underground Railroad and stuff. So I kind of became obsessed with this idea of braids and hair, and how hair has been suppressed. Black hair has been suppressed and reclaimed and brought forth, especially with younger generations. And right now, in present time, right? It's something to be celebrated. Whereas when I was growing up, you put that relaxer on your head, your hair needed to be straight. You needed to, that was, this kind of Western European beauty standard that was still placed upon us. And we've kind of gone through it, right? The 70s were, in the 60s were a time, along with the civil rights movement, of natural hair. So it's thinking about all these connections and how just our hair was a sign of resistance and revolt, and how amazing that is. And then the ramifications as threads that come in through to modern times. So all I knew was that I wanted to create a bust of some sort. And I wanted that woman to have braids that then kind of melded into a plantation house. I didn't actually know how that was going to work. And that's really how the work evolves. Is I'll catch a thread of something that I read in an article or in some historic text, and I kind of know what visually I want to talk about, but I don't know how it's going to come together. And this is going to sound real woo-woo, but I think it's legitimate. In my search for my ancestors, I really feel like I'm being guided in this work. And that's because when I made Maître Le Fou, I was creating her. I created her in the classroom so my students saw. And one of my friends, who's the photography teacher, her name is Tina, was watching me, and I was just instinctively gluing things, right, doing my assemblage. La, la, la. And I was putting all these pearls on, and I didn't know why. I was like, these need to be here. I don't know why they need to be here. And I was gluing them. And so, she came in, everybody's kind of watching me do this, other teachers too. And she was like, what do the pearls mean? I was like, I don't know. I just feel like they need to be there. And she's like, hold up. And so she left the classroom. And then she comes racing back in and she's like, so you know about the pearl incident then? And I was like, no, what is the pearl incident? And the pearl incident is the pearl was the schooner. It was the largest slave escape attempt in the history of America. So like 75 slaves tried to escape on this schooner called the Pearl during that time. So then it was like, oh, something's happening here. I don't know what it is. And I'm not really a woo-woo type of person. But then I was like, okay, well, even if it's like fabricated in my own mind, I still feel like I'm being led to different stories, to different subjects, to different visuals. So there's an element of like research, and then there's an element of like kind of moving instinctually, which is very different for me. I'm a planner. I'm a Capricorn. So that was very, very different for me. And I'm just trying to explore that more. So I'm building a piece right now about the Edmondson sisters, which were two very famous sisters. They were abolitionists that were on the Pearl, and they're very tied to the history of the Pearl incident. So yeah, I feel like there's also this like kind of undercurrent that's happening that I don't quite understand. And I think a lot of artists can kind of relate to that, though. We don't always know what we make, and then it makes sense afterwards,
I think that's so true and so powerful it's hard to let yourself be instinctual in some places. I feel like I'm such a planner too, and it's always a challenge to let go of that. But I feel like that's where the best work comes. When you can, plan things out to some extent, but then let it be what feels right and what you're drawn to do. Just do that.
And then if it doesn't work, tearing it apart, it's okay.
Yeah, totally. Like, I feel like the best advice that I got repeatedly throughout grad school was like, don't be so precious. Don't be so precious about it.
I tell that to my students all the time, because we are, as artists, like we're kind of wired that way. And I even make them do projects where, okay, I don't tell them beforehand, but I say, okay, do this still life. Okay, now rip it up. And they're like, what? Like, what are you asking me to do? And I definitely need to take my own advice, but a lot of times, especially with the more figurative work, I feel like those, and it's always of women, I feel like they are kind of telling me who they are when I'm making them. So it's like, I will talk to my sculptures like a weirdo. I'll be like, who are you? What is it? What are you about? Like, what facet of my research is manifesting here? Like, who are? So if you know me, that's not super characteristic of me to give personalities to objects. But I actually do enjoy it. It's kind of a whimsical, almost childlike thing that I think we lose as an adult, talking to our toys, creating these worlds, and having the objects give us input into who they are in these worlds. That was very natural as a kid, not so much as an adult. So
yeah, but that's an interesting thing to bring back. And I feel like ties into the combination you were talking about of research and really, digging into sort of the historical facts and what happened, and then also letting that imagination come in and intuition come in. Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't got it down yet. So ask me in 5 years if I've like figured out this weird practice that I'm developing. But
Well, I feel like these sculptures are so, so powerful, so beautiful. And part of it too is like there's the adornment that I can see connecting to fashion, but there's also like the colors feel so important and specific, and the way you're using color. Yeah. And then there's so much like they tell stories, you're talking about telling stories to them, like talking to them, asking them what stories they tell. But I feel like as the viewer, there's stories there.
yeah, there is a piece of education that I'm trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
And it might not be with all of them. Like the Josiah's cabin it almost looks like a layer cake kind of structure with a cabin on the top, and it has a hand coming out of it, and everything's white except for the hand in the door and the light that's coming from within. And that really is talking about a specific thing. And it's talking about specifically about Uncle Tom's cabin and the whitewashing of that story. That is really remarkable. Uncle Tom's Cabin, a lot of us read it as kids, and it has its own problematic pieces. Like the woman who wrote it was an abolitionist, and she was inspired by this slave called Josiah who became a free man, but she never gave him credit. She only occasionally mentioned him, but it was well known that this was part of his story. And that was such a powerful thing. All of the literature coming out about, for a specific purpose of abolition, right? And so after the emancipation, and even during that time, we have minstrel shows, right, that start popping up. And the first minstrel show was Uncle Tom's Cabin. And it was done completely in blackface, and it had very problematic, horrible stereotypes of slaves and Black men and women. And it was not the story of Uncle Tom, but it was a real strategic attempt to erase that story. And it was in this new story that was throughout minstrel shows was that Uncle Tom was like this Sambo, this traitor, right? He was a sympathizer to his white masters and things like that. And that was not necessarily the story of Uncle Tom. And so this was so successful that even today, as a Black person, you will hear somebody say, okay, Uncle Tom, right? And they're referring to being a traitor or being, a sympathizer to white supremacy. It's really kind of this negative connotation. And if you look at the history of just this one story and how strategically it was whitewashed and changed, we took this person that was a hero in his story and turned it into a negative and for Black people. So they erased the heroism, I don't know how to say that, of this person, right? And so, if you are an oppressed people, your heroes are what keep you going, right? It's important for the oppressor to make sure you don't have those heroes, right? You don't have those stories. So it was really kind of about how this one thing is a larger, it's bigger than just Uncle Tom's Cabin. We can see that this thread runs through history in a lot of different ways, in a lot of different minorities or oppressed people. And we see that, and it's really insidious. It was shocking to me when I started doing the research, like all of the things that had happened to this story in order for it to come to a negative spot for even Black people, right? Because I don't even know if they teach Uncle Tom's Cabin anymore. It used to be a big thing, but I haven't heard about it in a while. So it's kind of a rough book too, to be, it's not an easy text to read. So that's what that's about. It's about a specific thing, right? Whereas Maître Le Fou is about all these different concepts of hair and things. So I don't know if that helped kind of explain the kind of content, the concepts that I'm working with.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. It's so interesting and helpful to hear about, working on focusing a piece like you do with Josiah's Cabin versus having a piece that really ties together lots of concepts.
Mm-hmm.
I think both of those are really powerful, and, it's interesting too how in both of those there's a story, even,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's very, very specific like that. Or, I mean, there's so many things that are also like very specific about, I feel like I'm going to butcher the way to say the name, Mitzrelefu.
Yeah, that was pretty good. That was really good.
Right.
I'm not French,
Thank
so
you.
like I might be saying it a little crappy too. So sorry to any French people.
Yeah. Yeah, but it just super powerful work. I feel like I'm going to be seeing this, like, maybe this is too much, but seeing this in like the Whitney, like this is really beautiful, powerful work.
Please.
Yes.
Bring that to a manifestation. That would be amazing.
Yes. Say it out loud.
Say it out loud. Speak it to the universe. Yeah. Yeah. There also is, so this work that I'm doing really kind of revolves around the antebellum South. And when you're digging into stuff like that, it can be pretty rough. There's some really ugly stuff that the average person doesn't know about, like buck breaking and lynching postcards and all those things. And if you look those up, just be aware that you're going to see some really horrific stuff. But this actually happened to people. It was a tenet of slavery and white supremacy. So there is another element of work that I do that's just fun. And I think that's important. And I'm trying to develop that more, like a balance. There is a drive, like a need for me to create the work around my ancestry and around these hidden histories. But there's also like this kind of fun element. So a lot of times I have just like a side project called Heavenly Nobodies. And it's just artwork imaged around like music from my youth. So it's like really just visuals that I've created around song lyrics, because that really drives me. Again, another Capricorn characteristic, I am told. So like there's a painting on the site called Pure Morning of a young man, and it's based off of Placebo's Pure Morning. So a lot of it is like post-punk, like British. I don't know where that came from in me, but also like maybe some old hip hop, because I'm an old person. I don't listen to a lot of new hip hop. So like trying to kind of, that's like, I might make prints and sell those, those things. It's a little different. So I feel like there's different aspects of what I'm doing, but I feel like that piece is kind of a release. If you're doing anything heavy like this, I feel like you need some just kind of fun side art to make, even if it's just in your sketchbook or something,
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like that ties into, what we were talking about earlier with just burnout and needing rest, needing to find that balance. Yeah. I feel like probably a lot of artists have, I know I have work that I do that's just for me, that I don't share, that's just like, sometimes it's just fun, really easy watercolor, just playing with colors. Sometimes it's things that I use to get out emotion or get out frustrations.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And even as we talk about it, I'm thinking, you got to do more of that, Elizabeth. Like, you need to do more of that.
Thank you so much for talking through and sharing more of the concepts and sharing your work. It's been really like wonderful to look at it and hear more about it. And when I share the episode, I'll share images. So everyone who's listening, you should check out Liz's website, we'll do a blog, and we'll be sharing on Instagram. So all of it. Look at these images. They're amazing.
Thank you. It's really a privilege to be able to sit down and talk with, like-minded artists about your work. It's really special for me. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we wrap up, I have a couple of questions that I ask everybody that I think of as like get to know you questions. What are you curious about right now?
What am I curious? So many things. Oh my gosh. Like
Right.
so many things. It's ridiculous. Actually, I'm very curious about okay, so I'm curious about the religions of Africa before they were
Mm,
colonized. So I've been looking a lot
mm,
into the Yoruba religions of Orishas, and which then kind of, it translated when it came to the States into what they call hoodoo and sometimes voodoo.
mm,
And this kind of practice and where it began and that religion in general, has some really interesting and beautiful elements. So I'm really
mm,
curious about that. And I'm also really curious about tarot. So I find that I use tarot to kind of center myself and kind of think about, most cards will give you something to think about, but I don't always know the history of the cards and stuff like that and their full meaning.
mm.
So I've been kind of looking into that and seeing, it's kind of interesting. So those are some of the things that I've just kind of been tinkering with lately.
Yeah. So interesting. I'm curious how it will come out in your
It
work.
probably will, yeah.
I'm like, that's going to come up.
Yeah.
Uh, okay. Just a kind of silly, fun question. And I feel like food is such a like way to, I don't know, it's like there's cultural connections to food and
Mhm.
it's an interesting way to like learn more about people. So I always like to ask, what's your favorite food?
Oh wow. So I think it would be so I call myself the noodle queen. Like I love noodles, particularly Asian noodles. My husband is
Mm,
biracial like me, and he's Vietnamese, and so his
mm,
family we go to see. They always make pho,
mm,
and just the most amazing, delicious dishes. So I think my
mm,
favorite food would probably be anywhere from like pho to like a ramen, with
mm,
all of the stuff in it. I like all of the things. But I could probably eat any sort of Asian, so eat like a pad thai, any of
mm.
that stuff for the rest of my life if I had to.
Oh,
So that's my favorite.
so good.
Yeah, I just love that stuff so much.
And I'm jealous that you have home cooked pho.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome. I'm not
Oh.
gonna lie.
Oh. And then is there anyone that you would want to give a shout out to or a thank you?
I just want to thank my, I have a small grouping of local artists that we've really been and the art teachers and we've been really supporting each other through this. And I just want to thank Andrea Levy, which I think you've talked to, who's a
Yeah.
good friend, and we've really kind of been holding each other's hands through this
Oh.
pandemic experience. But also, she's also moving through grad school and I'm starting it, and
Mhm.
it's just been really great, and her artwork is amazing and wonderful. And
Mhm.
yeah, I would say check her out. And yeah, thank you, Andrea, for being my art community this year. It's a lot.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, I love that. And thank you also, Andrea, for connecting us.
Yeah,
It's amazing.
definitely. Yes, that was so sweet. So awesome. Yeah.
Yeah. And then last thing, where can listeners connect with you online?
So you can go to my website. It's lizdennauart.com.
Mhm.
And Liz is spelled with two Z's. So
Mhm.
LIZZDENNEAU art.com. And also you can find me on Instagram, Liz underscore Denneau, I believe underscore art on Instagram. And from there, I have links to any other projects that I'm doing. So if you look in the bio there's a link to Heavenly Nobodies if you're interested in 90s art made around 90s music lyrics, and then Metro the Foo kind of sculptural works are
Mm.
there too. So you can find me on there. I'm friendly. You can DM me. I'll talk to you about art. I'll talk to anybody about
Uh,
art for reals though.
I love that. Yes. And I will link to all of it as well.
Thank you.
So, yes. Thank you so much, Liz. This was fantastic.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. This was really fun. And this is my first podcast. So it was really exciting.
You were awesome.
Yay.
I love it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. As always, you can reach me at Teaching Artist Podcast on Instagram or teachingartistpodcast@gmail.com. Who do you want to hear from? Please share your recommendations of teaching artists. And if you loved this episode, please subscribe, leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow me. It really makes a big difference. Thank you.